what we have done as a church in this country is we have abandoned our faith willingly and become Christians who just aren't really worth the trouble of persecutors. And that's what we find in these areas where there's persecution. We find, Satan, it's sort of a carrot versus stick approach. And the Christians who face very real and violent persecution are getting the stick, whereas for us, it's sort of the carrot, where we are drifting along on the tide of the culture and going wherever it takes us, very comfortably, of course. But in this case, it's taking us into faithlessness and, ultimately damnation.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Matt Walsh, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Church of Cowards, A Wake-Up Call to Complacent Christians. Matt, it's truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, let's kick off our conversation today by talking about a bit of what we might call the Matt Walsh origin story. I've actually never heard anything in any great detail maybe about your church background or kind of your conversion, so would love to get just a little bit of a snapshot of that for the first part of our conversation.
In terms of my faith background, I was raised Christian. I had the good fortune of being raised in a good Christian household, so that part of life for me has been easy, I guess you might say. Maybe easy isn't the right word, but we can, and I take that as a parent. I know I can make it easier on my kids by raising them in the faith and giving them the truth early on and an understanding of it. So I've always had that, and that's also why I admire converts to the faith. I mean, people who had to go out really and seek it, who were not raised in the truth and had to go out and find it. I have a lot of respect and admiration for that. That's the story of that, pretty much. And in terms of what I do for a living, I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now and building an audience. And, I feel really fortunate to, have an audience of people that are interested in having these conversations.
Next, let's transition into the story behind the book. As a guy who works in the publishing industry, I'm always curious kind of what was that spark or what was that catalyst that got a book project moving down a certain path. So in terms of the book Church of Cowards, what was the problem or issue that alerted you to a need for a book like this?
Well, the problem is, I think, is the same problem that most Christians in this country observe and notice, which is that, and we're told in media headlines all the time that Christianity is on the decline in this country. And if you look at the numbers, I don't have them in front of me, but it's, something like 75% or so of America is now Christian, which is a marked decline. And we see a precipitous decline over the years of people who identify as Christian. But we also know that the situation, unfortunately, is much worse than that. I mean, if it was true that 75-80% of America was Christian, then I think we'd be in a much, even if that's less than what there was in the past, we'd be in a much different situation culturally than we actually are in. I think the reality is that, we say 70, 75, 80%. It's much smaller than that. If we dig down into, all these people who profess to be Christian, what do they actually believe? And how serious do they take their faith? And how observant of it are they? When you look at that, I think it becomes clear that the situation is even more dire. So that's the beginning point, is simply noticing that problem, which I'm certainly not the first person to notice it. And then the next question is, how did we end up this way? What happened exactly? And that's what I wrote the book to try to analyze and get to the bottom of, basically, is how did we end up here as a culture? What's going wrong? And then if we can figure that out, then we can maybe figure out how to solve it.
I read a ton of Christian books every year. And I have to say, the opening of Church of Cowards is probably one of the most jarring introductions or kind of first acts, if you will, that I've seen in this space for a while. So I'd love to talk about that next. The book opens with what I would say is a very memorable fictional account where we encounter a diverse group of Christians. They end up not being worthy of martyrdom. So I'd love for you to take us briefly into that scenario that you open the book with and give us a little insight into what you were hoping to provoke in the mind of the reader.
So this really came from conversations I've had with various Christians through the years who are concerned that in this country we may one day face the sort of persecution that Christians overseas face now and have faced for 2,000 years. And we know that in some countries in the world, the Middle East and some parts of North Africa and Asia, the persecution is worse for Christians there than it's ever been before. So the concern that I encounter from Christians sometimes in this country is that, well, what if that happens here? When is the day going to come when the persecutors arrive on our shores to do the same sort of thing and start beheading Christians and so on and martyring Christians? And so in the first chapter of the book, I tried to, in a sort of intentionally absurd way, of course, but I tried to imagine what would actually happen if persecutors came here looking for Christians to persecute. And of course, the conclusion that I illustrate in the chapter is that there really wouldn't be very many Christians for them to come here and persecute. If the persecutors came looking for Christians to kill, that's why the title of that chapter is Christians Not Worth Killing. What they would find is that either there really aren't that many authentic Christians to persecute, or the ones that they do find, it's just not worth the trouble. Because what we have done as a church in this country is we have abandoned our faith willingly and become Christians who just aren't really worth the trouble of persecutors. And that's what we find in these areas where there's persecution. We find, Satan, it's sort of a carrot versus stick approach. And the Christians who face very real and violent persecution are getting the stick, whereas for us, it's sort of the carrot, where we are drifting along on the tide of the culture and going wherever it takes us, very comfortably, of course. But in this case, it's taking us into faithlessness and, ultimately damnation.
And in terms of the things that are lulling the church to sleep here in the West, or maybe we're distracting ourselves to death, so to speak, what are maybe the worst of those, or maybe the most prevalent?
It's almost hard to point to one specific thing, and that's what you could almost say, give a chapter to each thing. When it comes to the things that are distracting us, that's the way the culture is set up. There's a million things that are distracting us every single day, and that's sort of intentional. And so the obvious things, of course, would be like pop culture and the glowing screens that we spend. I think it's 10 hours a day on average Americans spend looking at screens of various kinds, ingesting various kinds of media. And so there are these kinds of distractions. Even in the worship experience in many churches, there's a whole lot of distraction, a whole lot of sort of bells and whistles, lights and sounds and fog machines and everything that I think have the effect of distracting us from the more serious, sacred business of actually worshiping God and reflecting on these sacred mysteries.
In terms of a time of year when I feel like there's this surprising fervor, if you will, that rises up in Christians, it probably seems to be most around Christmas time. And we go after whether it's coffee cups from Starbucks that we have issue with, or people saying happy holidays versus Merry Christmas, or, we could point to a bunch of different things. But when it comes to facing what we might call persecution or going after things that are difficult, why do we tend to distract ourselves with these meaningless things?
You talk about the so-called war on Christmas, and you find these little culture battles that pop up every year, like you said, around Christmas time. I find that most of that is totally irrelevant, and it doesn't really bother me at all. I don't care if I go to the supermarket and the cashier says Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. It makes no difference to me. I don't need my faith affirmed by the cashier at the supermarket. That's not something that I need. And also, I don't need to be lied to. In other words, it seems like there are some Christians, and maybe this is why they get so focused on this, is that they want to look around and see Christmas everywhere and hear it acknowledged. Essentially, they want the culture to lie to them, and they want to be able to pretend, at least for a few weeks every year, that they live in a Christian culture. But that's not the culture we live in. It's just not. We live in a secular culture. So that's going to be reflected during Christmas season. It ought to be. Arguably, it ought to be reflected even more. I mean, arguably, people should be saying Merry Christmas less than they do, because that's just the reality of the culture that we live in. And I think that's why people focus on it, though, is that, number one, they want to be lied to. They want to think that things are better than they are. And also, it's just easier to fight a battle over Starbucks cups or what the cashier says to you, rather than some of these more serious moral challenges that we face. Things that, if we engage with them, that may require real sacrifice on our part. I think it's easier to look away from that and to the less important things.
Well, and you had mentioned a moment ago in terms of kind of the worship experience, there can be things that distract us, be it lights, fog machines, and whatnot. But more broadly speaking, if you walk into, say, the average evangelical church building here in America, things are pretty generic, kind of vanilla looking. You might even say it looks a lot like a shopping mall. For me, as a guy who grew up in more liturgical settings, as I go into the typical modern evangelical church, I feel like we've kind of lost something in terms of reverence and awe when it comes to architecture, icon, art, all that sort of thing. That's all been stripped away. Would love to just get your perspective a little bit about losing all of those markers of the faith, at least in the physical and visual. How has that maybe taken away some of the reverence and awe we saw in generations past?
It's easy to say that, well, what the building looks like doesn't matter. What you wear when you go to church doesn't matter. The artwork and all this stuff, none of this matters. I mean, it's easy to say that. And it's, of course, true that that's not the most important thing. But it does matter. I mean, it is important because we're human beings. And these things, symbolism, artwork, the aesthetic experience, that's all important to us. It can help to put us in the right frame of mind or the wrong frame of mind. And I think when you walk into a church, it should be an experience of being elevated into something transcendent, into something even mystical, if you like. That should be the experience of entering a church. And that should be clear, not just in the message you're hearing from the pastor in the pulpit, but from everything, from the attitude and reverence of the congregants to the way that they're dressed, even the architecture. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it? Why are so many churches seemingly literally built to imitate and look like everything else you see in the culture? Why are they built to blend in, to camouflage themselves, rather than standing out in a proud and courageous way?
And Matt, you had referenced earlier the fact that persecution of Christians across the globe, that's definitely been on the rise. Here in the West, I think we tend to feel persecuted when somebody takes our favorite parking spot, the coffee shop up in the church commons area. It's unexpectedly shut down for the day. But I think we're in a season right now where a lot of us are like thinking, well, are we going to come up against some persecution here in the weeks and the months ahead? Yet I feel like we're at this interesting place where if people are just kind of in the same complacent, lulled to sleep sort of situation that many Christians have been in here in the West for some time, if they don't stand up, if they don't start taking their faith more seriously, I don't know that for a lot of people that's necessarily going to change. But as we look at how culture's responding and looking to the season ahead, should we expect persecution, or does that depend on what we do?
In some ways, it depends on what we do. Now, obviously, when I wrote the book, I wasn't quite anticipating the situation that we would be in shortly after the book came out, where churches, in fact, are shut down all across the country, which I don't think anybody was expecting. And I actually do think that this does amount to a form of persecution, in my opinion. I mean, this is an attack on the First Amendment and religious liberty, shutting down churches, arresting people for worshiping. I mean, if that's not an attack on the First Amendment, I don't know what is. And this is not to minimize it at all, because it is very serious. I think that we're going to transition out of this. And, in a few months' time, probably most churches, at least in a few months' time, if not earlier, most churches in America will basically be open again, if in a sort of revised way in how they go about their services. And it will be very easy then for people to kind of slip back into their normal routines and start living a very comfortable life again, and, not thinking about mortality and not thinking much about their faith. And I think that is what could happen, probably will happen. And that's one of the dangers of living in such a comfortable environment where most of the time, and in the last few months have been different, but most of the time we don't have to think about our mortality. We don't have to think about the fact that we're not going to be here very long at all. We don't have to think about what comes after this. Maybe if that's one positive thing we take from this, is hopefully keeping our mortality in mind and how temporary life is, and keeping that in mind as well.
Another thing you address in the book is that a lot of Christians struggle to see maybe that inconsistency between what they profess they believe and how that practically plays out into their day-to-day lives. And I think you kind of touched on this a little earlier in terms of statistically with how many people would identify as being a Christian. It's almost like we culturally identify as part of a Christian group, but our actual practices are much more informed by mainstream culture, much more informed by secular culture. Why do we tend to maybe ignore that problem? I feel like we almost compartmentalize it to an extent. From your perspective, why do we ignore that, and how do we change that? How do we start shifting that so we can be aware of that problem?
The thing we have to ask ourselves, we have to do an inventory and think, okay, these are all the things that I claim to believe as a Christian. And really, when you think about it, as Christians, we make a lot of pretty startling and extraordinary claims about the nature of reality and life after death, and everything, right? We can get numb to it, and it could be almost normalized in a way that it shouldn't be, actually, because there is something very extraordinary about what we profess, and beautiful as well. So we have to start by looking at that and saying, okay, do I actually believe this stuff? And I think if many Christians were being honest with themselves and they really asked us, okay, do I believe all of this? Do I really believe it? I think a lot of Christians would have to admit that, no, I don't believe all of these things. But those of us who can say, yes, I really do believe this, I absolutely believe it, then we have to start asking ourselves, does the reality of this belief, does it infiltrate every aspect of our lives or not? Because clearly it should. And I think what we're going to find is, like you said, compartmentalization, that What we do is we take our faith and our beliefs, even if they're sincere, we put them in a little box in the corner, and we open it up for religious occasions like going to church or whatever, or holidays. And then most of the rest of the time we put it back in the box and we go about living our lives. It can't be that way. If we really believe these things, that should be something that informs everything we do, without exception.
And Matt, a slight left turn for a moment. Christian movies, helpful or are they a hindrance?
First of all, it depends on the movie. I'm not going to sit here and say that every Christian movie is bad or good or what have you. I tend to think that most of the time, with the way the Christian movies are made and approached, they're not very helpful. I don't think that they're going to hurt you necessarily. I think for the most part, they're harmless. But there is a sort of cynical thing that I think you find with some of these Christian media companies, and this to include also a lot of the Christian music that's out there, the Christian pop and rock and all that kind of stuff. I think it can be sometimes cynical, where the people that make this stuff, they know that there's an audience that will eat it up no matter what, no matter the quality. And so there's not a lot of effort put into things like having a good script and good actors and actually having a worthwhile story. And so a lot of times these Christian movies end up being sort of embarrassing. And it shouldn't be that way. And especially when you compare it to, for example, my favorite author is Dostoevsky. And if you want to say he was a Christian author who wrote Christian stories, but that wasn't the genre. He was just an author who told stories. And because he was a Christian, that belief system came out in the stories in a really deep and profound way. But he was also just a great author who was great at telling stories. I think that's what we really need. We need Christians, and let's say in the film industry, we need Christians who are great storytellers, and they tell stories, and their Christianity informs those stories. But it doesn't have to hit you over the head with it, right? And same thing with music. I think we need great Christian singers and artists whose faith informs their music, but it doesn't have to be the Christian genre necessarily.
Overall, in terms of the reader's journey with the book, when they get to the last page, they close that back flap. What's the solution? What's the path forward you hope every single reader has heard from their time spent with the book?
I hope the main thing they take away from it is sort of what we were just talking about a minute ago. And this is what I'm very happy when I do hear this from some people who have read the book, that it did cause them to stop and analyze their life and their belief systems and ask themselves, do I believe this? Do I really take it seriously? And if I do, does it inform every aspect of my life? That's the question I had to ask myself repeatedly when I'm writing it, and I have to ask myself this every day. And what I find inevitably is that the answer is always, to some extent, no. There's always parts of my life that are not informed by my faith, and so I have to continually acknowledge that and try to get right back on the right path. So I hope that's what people take from the book.
And Matt, for the listeners who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where can we find you on the web?
I write for the Daily Wire, so you can go to dailywire.com, or you can find me on Facebook, and you can find especially now, of course, you can find the book on Amazon.
Well, like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Matt and pick up your own copy of the book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Matt Walsh. Once again, our book today was Church of Cowards, a wake-up call to complacent Christians. Again, if you'd like to connect with Matt and find out more, a great place to start is the Daily Wire website. You can find that over at dailywire.com. And Matt, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's truly been an honor to have you on the show.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.